The silence in the penthouse office felt heavy enough to press against Clara's chest. She sat rigid, in a leather chair, positioned across from a desk so large it could have passed for a conference table. The mahogany surface gleamed under the glow of recessed lighting, each reflection sharp and deliberate, much like the man seated across from her. Her fingers rested on a sleek black pen, poised above the final page of a contract. The paper beneath her hand felt weightier than its few sheets should allow. Every word printed on it, carrying the potential to alter her life in ways she wasn't sure she could measure. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched endlessly, its late afternoon skyline muted by a haze of winter light. Cars moved far below like small, insignificant currents, while up here everything seemed still, unnervingly still. Sebastian Knight, the man behind the desk, regarded her without speaking. He was immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, not a crease out of place, his posture so precise it felt intentional. His gaze never wavered, fixed on her with a calm that was difficult to read. There was no trace of warmth in his expression, only a steady, evaluating focus that made Clara's pulse quicken. She knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was not a meeting she could walk away from unchanged. Sebastian's voice broke the stillness with the precision of a blade cutting through silk. "Once you sign this," he said, his tone even, deliberate, "we're married. No romance. No strings." The words were not a suggestion. They were delivered with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without hesitation. His eyes remained locked on hers, unblinking, as though measuring every flicker of her reaction. Clara tightened her grip on the pen. A marriage stripped of tenderness, laid out like a business acquisition. It was almost absurd, yet there was nothing in his voice to suggest humor, no hint that he might be exaggerating for effect. His statement lingered in the air, cold and exact. She could feel her heart drumming against her ribs, the weight of the contract suddenly heavier in her hand. Her throat felt dry, and for a moment she wondered if she'd misheard him. But Sebastian didn't repeat himself. He didn't need. He simply leaned back in his chair, hands resting loosely on the armrests, as if the decision before her were as straightforward as choosing between two menu options. Somewhere deep inside, Clara understood that whatever she decided in this moment would bind her to him, not just on paper, but in ways she couldn't yet name. The tip of the pen hovered over the page, but Clara's mind was no longer in that pristine office. It was back in her apartment, a place so small she could reach the kitchen sink from the couch. She saw the stack of unpaid bills spread across the chipped coffee table, the red letters stamped across them screaming final notice. She could hear the landlord's voice again, flat and impatient. "If the rent's not here by Friday, you're out." He hadn't even bothered to look her in the eye. Then there was the hospital room, walls painted in faded beige, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the space. Her brother lay pale and thin beneath the scratchy blanket, his eyes closed in uneasy rest. The doctor's words still burned in her ears. "We need to move forward with treatment immediately. Without it, his condition will worsen." She had nodded numbly that day, clutching a payment plan she knew she couldn't meet. 2 jobs weren't enough. 10 wouldn't be enough. The memory shifted again, to the moment she'd found the eviction notice taped to her door. She'd stood in the hallway, staring at it until the paper blurred. That was only 2 days ago. Now she was here, in front of a man who could erase all of it with a single signature. Clara forced herself to look up from the contract, expecting to meet the same detached stare he'd held since she arrived. But Sebastian's eyes were not entirely empty now. They moved over her slowly, not with the casual indifference of a man assessing a stranger, but with the precision of someone cataloguing details. The faint tremor in her hand, the crease between her brows, the way her shoulders squared, despite the tension radiating from her frame. It was the look of a man weighing value, as though she were part of a high-stakes equation only he could see. Yet, just for a heartbeat, something different surfaced. A brief, unguarded flicker that softened the hard lines of his face. Curiosity. It was gone, almost instantly, replaced by the polished, impenetrable mask he wore so well. But Clara had seen it, and it unsettled her more than the contract in front of her. That single fleeting shift in his gaze left her with the uncomfortable sense that he was not only studying her for the deal, but for something else entirely. Something he had no intention of admitting. Her fingers curled tighter around the pen, the air between them carrying an unspoken question neither of them seemed willing to voice. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside the glass walls. Clara's thumb grazed the edge of the pen, her mind caught between two equally impossible paths. Sebastian didn't push. He didn't plead. He simply waited, his gaze steady, the contract lying between them like a silent ultimatum. Her pulse thudded in her ears, matching the ticking of the clock on the wall. Every second that passed felt like another thread binding her to this moment, to him. If she signed, her brother's treatment could begin within hours. The bills would disappear. The eviction would be forgotten. She could breathe again, but at what cost? She glanced at Sebastian once more, catching the faintest lift of his eyebrow. A challenge, as though daring her to make the choice. Welcome to Mr. Roman's Story Vault. Big thanks to our returning viewers, and a special hello to new friends. Before we find out why this cold CEO wants her as his bride, tell me, would you take the deal if marriage was the only way to save someone you love? Drop your answer in the comments. Hit that like button if you're curious to see how this plays out. And subscribe so you won't miss the twists that are coming. The apartment barely qualified as one. 2 small rooms connected by a short hallway, a bathroom with a door that stuck in the winter, and a kitchen whose tiles bore long, jagged cracks like scars that had been there for years. The heater rattled when it ran, sounding like loose coins in a tin, and the single window in the living room overlooked the alley behind a grocery store. And yet, Clara had made it her own. A soft, worn blanket folded neatly on the couch. A chipped mug she'd bought for $1, but loved because it kept tea warm longer than it should. A faded photograph of her and her brother taped to the refrigerator door. Both of them laughing on a day when life still felt light. The air smelled faintly of laundry soap from the clothes drying on a rack in the corner. On the sill, a small potted plant fought to catch what little sunlight made it through the smudged glass. Clara tended to it every morning, convinced that if it could survive here, so could she. It wasn't much, but every corner carried the imprint of her care. For anyone else, the space might have felt like a burden. For Clara, it was a fortress, thin walls and all. It was where she fought every day to keep her world from falling apart. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and frying oil, the kind of scent that clung to her clothes, no matter how many times she washed them. Clara moved quickly between the tables, balancing plates in one hand and refilling mugs with the other, offering practiced smiles to customers who barely looked up from their phones. By the time her shift ended at 3 p.m., her feet ached and her back felt tight from hours of bending and rushing. But there was no time to rest. Not if she wanted to make rent. She would walk the 8 blocks home, change into her second uniform, and catch the bus to the office building, where she worked nights as a cleaner. That job was quieter, but it came with its own kind of weight. The hallways echoed with her footsteps, and the scent of disinfectant lingered as she emptied trash cans and wiped down desks. Each time she caught her reflection in the tall glass doors, she looked older than she remembered. Her hair pulled back tightly, shadows under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. Some nights, exhaustion tempted her to skip dinner altogether, but she'd push through because her brother needed his meals on time and his medication carefully measured. She reminded herself that every hour she worked was another step toward keeping a roof over their heads. For Clara, rest wasn't an option. Survival was a full-time job, and she worked it without complaint. When Clara returned home, the apartment was dim except for the small lamp beside the couch. On it sat a glass of water and a neatly folded blanket, placed there in case her brother needed them before she came back. Eli, the name she had given him since birth, and the one she now guarded fiercely, was propped up against a pillow, a book resting on his lap. His skin was pale, and dark circles shadowed his eyes, but he looked up with a smile the moment she stepped inside. "You're late," he teased softly, though his voice carried the thin rasp of someone whose strength never fully returned. Clara set her bag down and moved to the kitchen, measuring his medication with care before bringing it to him. "I stopped to get your favorite bread. Thought you'd like it for breakfast tomorrow." He took the pills without complaint, chasing them with a sip of water. She sat beside him, tucking the blanket over his legs. Her hand lingered on his knee for a moment, part comfort, part silent, reassurance that she was here, and she wasn't going anywhere. They didn't talk about the hospital visits, unless they had to. The strain of medical bills and appointments hung in the background of their lives like an uninvited guest. Clara shielded him from as much as she could, carrying the weight herself. For her, every extra shift, every hour without sleep, was worth it if it meant keeping him safe. He wasn't just her brother. He was the reason she refused to give up, no matter how impossible things seemed. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was rinsing dishes. A message from Mia, one of the waitresses at the diner, lit up the screen. "We're going out after shift tomorrow." "You in?" Clara stared at it for a moment before typing a quick reply. "Can't. Double shift." It was easier than explaining the truth, that she couldn't justify spending money on drinks when the electric bill was due next week. It was always like that. Her friends from work would talk about weekend trips or buying new clothes, and she'd smile and nod, keeping her own reality tucked away where no one could see it. If they knew how close she was to losing the apartment or how much debt she was drowning in because of hospital costs, they might offer help. And accepting help, that wasn't something Clara could bring herself to do. She had learned long ago that people's kindness often came with strings. Promises to be there faded. Pity turned into gossip. She'd rather they think she was simply too busy to join in, rather than someone scraping to hold her life together. So she kept her answers short, her smile steady, and her problems locked behind a wall she built herself. If the weight grew heavier, she bore it in silence. That way, there was no risk of disappointment, and no risk of anyone seeing just how fragile things really were. After Eli drifted off to sleep, Clara sat at the small table in the kitchen with a mug of tea that had already gone cold. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. And for the first time, all day, she allowed herself to breathe without rushing. Her gaze drifted to the plant on the windowsill, its leaves curling slightly toward the faint light outside. It was stubborn, refusing to wilt even in this cramped space. A part of her admired that. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a photo from Mia, smiling at a cafe table with friends. Laughter practically radiated from the image. Clara smiled faintly before setting the phone face down. She had long since stopped daydreaming about candlelit dinners or weekend getaways. Romance, in her mind, was a luxury for people who had time to linger, who could afford to give parts of themselves away without risking the whole. She didn't have that. Every piece of her was spoken for. Her shifts at the diner, her cleaning job, her brother's care, and the unending fight to keep their heads above water. Love was unpredictable, and unpredictability wasn't something she could afford. Not now. Maybe not ever. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the cool ceramic ground her in that quiet truth. Whatever dreams she might have had when she was younger, they had no place here. Her world had no room for distractions, especially the kind that could break her heart. The city looked different from Sebastian Knight's office. From this height, the streets below seemed orderly, the noise of traffic muted into a distant hum. Floor-to-ceiling glass surrounded him on three sides, the skyline stretching endlessly, a sea of lights glittering against the early evening sky. He stood near the window, hands in the pockets of his tailored suit, his reflection sharp against the glass. Behind him, the office was a perfect mirror of its owner, sleek, minimal, without a single object out of place. A black marble desk dominated the space, its surface bare, except for a laptop and a neatly stacked folder. Sebastian had no patience for clutter, whether in his workspace or his life. Everything had its place. Everything had a purpose. That was how you built an empire and how you kept it. From this vantage point, he could see the entire financial district sprawled below. It was a view he'd worked for, fought for, and guarded fiercely. In the world he inhabited, power wasn't inherited without a fight, and keeping it required constant vigilance. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside, tablet in hand. "The board is waiting," she said. Sebastian gave one last glance at the city before turning away from the glass. Whatever awaited him in that meeting, he would face it with the same unflinching composure he carried into every deal. The boardroom was all polished wood, brushed steel, and discreet luxury, designed to impress without showing off. Around the table sat 11 of Knight Global's most influential figures, their tailored suits and measured expressions a testament to the power they represented. Sebastian took his seat at the head of the table, adjusting his cufflinks, with the ease of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. The agenda was already in front of him, but he didn't need to read it. He knew why they'd called this meeting. A senior board member cleared his throat. "Sebastian, your quarterly numbers are solid, but we've had concerns raised by certain investors." "Concerns," Sebastian repeated, leaning back in his chair. His tone was mild, but the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his irritation. Another member, a woman with a sharp gaze and a reputation for bluntness, spoke up. "They're uneasy with the way the media portrays you. High-profile events, no steady partner, an image. That suggests instability. For some of our more conservative stakeholders, that's becoming a problem." Sebastian's expression didn't change, though inside, the comment landed exactly as intended. He knew the press enjoyed painting him as an untouchable bachelor who played by his own rules. In truth, it was convenient to let them believe that. But convenience didn't appease investors. "If this is about control of perception," Sebastian said evenly, "then perception can be managed." The woman arched a brow. "Investors want reassurance, not damage control. A man in your position, they want to see stability, commitment." The word hung in the air like an unspoken ultimatum. Sebastian kept his gaze steady on the board members, but part of his mind drifted. Not because their words were unimportant, but because they echoed something he had heard before: stability, commitment, as if those things had ever been offered to him without a price. He had grown up surrounded by wealth, but warmth was a currency his parents never spent. His father was a man of deals and deadlines, his mother a fixture in high society photographs, but rarely at home. Sebastian learned early that affection, if it existed, was conditional. By the time he was 25, he had already taken over much of the family, corporate interests, reshaping Night Global into a powerhouse. That was when he'd met Elise, poised, elegant, and so he thought trustworthy. For a brief time, he had believed she was different. The illusion shattered the night he discovered her affair with none other than a business rival eager to undercut his control. Worse than the betrayal itself was the realization that Elise had been a strategic choice, not for love, but for access to him. That was the last time Sebastian allowed anyone to get close, without calculation. He closed himself off, treating relationships like transactions and keeping his personal life as controlled as his balance sheets. Now, listening to the board speak of commitment as if it were a marketing tool, Sebastian felt that familiar resistance settle in. Marriage was a liability, unless it served a clear purpose. As the board continued its cautious suggestions, Sebastian's thoughts shifted toward a far more pressing matter, one they weren't even aware of. His father's will had been explicit. In order to secure full control of Night Global's parent holdings, Sebastian needed to be married by his next birthday. The clause was old-fashioned, a relic of his grandfather's belief that a man could only be trusted with great power if he had a family to anchor him. Sebastian had always found it absurd. Up until recently, he'd been prepared to meet the condition in his own way, likely with someone agreeable, a temporary arrangement that would satisfy the legal requirement without entangling his life. But after the Elise debacle, he had delayed, unwilling to step into anything that could become another vulnerability. Now, with investor confidence slipping, the two issues had merged into one. A strategic marriage could solve them both, calm the board's concerns, reinforce the image of stability, and meet the inheritance condition in one clean move. Of course, the partner would have to be chosen with precision. No scandals, no hidden agendas. Someone whose reputation was unblemished, whose life couldn't be leveraged against him. Someone who could play the role convincingly, yet remain separate from the emotional spaces he guarded so carefully. He didn't need affection. He didn't need trust. He needed control. And control was something he never surrendered. The meeting ended with polite nods and murmured agreements. But Sebastian could feel the board's watchful eyes even as they left the room. He stood at the head of the table for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly on the polished surface, weighing the decision already forming in his mind. This wouldn't be a search for love. It would be a selection process. Efficient, controlled, with no room for error. Whoever he chose would need to fit the criteria perfectly. A clean history, a calm presence under pressure, and no ties that could compromise the arrangement. He stepped out of the boardroom, his assistant falling into step beside him. "Would you like me to prepare a short list?" she asked. "Not yet," he replied, his tone decisive. "I already have someone in mind." Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't question him. Sebastian returned to his office and stood once more before the glass wall, the city glittering below. His reflection stared back at him, composed, calculating. This was a move on a chessboard, nothing more. Still, in the quiet of his own thoughts, a question lingered. Why had her face come to mind so quickly? Sebastian believes this is just another calculated move in his empire's game. But is the woman he has in mind ready to sign away her future? for a man who claims he can never love her? Tell me in the comments. Could you live in a marriage built on nothing but terms and conditions? Hit like if you're curious where this leads. And make sure you're subscribed for what happens next. The call came just after Clara finished wiping down the last counter at the diner. She recognized the voice on the other end, crisp, formal, with the kind of precise tone that belonged to someone who never needed to repeat themselves. This is Knight Global. We received your application. Mr. Knight would like to meet you in person. Can you be here tomorrow morning at 10? She froze, mid-step. Knight Global was the kind of company that existed in headlines, not in the world she lived in. She had never sent them an application. Before she could say so, the voice added, "Bring a resume and be punctual." The line went dead. The next morning, she stood in the lobby of Knight Global's headquarters, clutching a folder and feeling wildly out of place among the sleek, dressed professionals passing by. The security guard checked her name against a list and waved her through to the private elevator. By the time the doors opened to the top floor, her palms were damp. The receptionist gestured her toward an enormous set of double doors. She stepped inside, and the city skyline spread out behind a desk that looked large enough to land a small plane on. Sebastian Knight was exactly as the papers described. Tall, controlled, impossibly sharp in a dark suit that fit like it had been made for him. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he motioned to the chair across from him. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice low and measured. "I'll be direct. This isn't a job interview in the traditional sense." She sat, trying to steady her breathing. "Then, what is it?" His gaze didn't waver. "An arrangement. One that will benefit us both." Clara blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "An arrangement," she echoed. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on hers, as if assessing her reaction was part of some unspoken test. "Marriage," he said plainly, as though the word were no more significant than signing a contract for office supplies. For a moment, the sound in the room seemed to fade. The distant hum of the city, the faint ticking of the clock, all drowned out by the thundering of her own heartbeat. "This is a joke, right?" she asked, forcing a short laugh. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied, voice even. "Your background is clean. No scandals, no debts beyond the usual student loans. You've maintained steady employment, despite less than ideal circumstances. You're exactly the kind of woman who can stand beside me without bringing unnecessary attention." Clara's brows drew together. "So, you want me to marry you? For what?" "Appearances." "Appearances," he confirmed. "And mutual benefit." Her grip on the folder in her lap tightened. "Mr. Knight, I don't know who told you I was desperate, but no one told me." He cut in smoothly. "I did my own research." The calm certainty in his tone made her uneasy. "You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted again, his gaze sharp. "And I am. This isn't about love, Miss Hale. It's about fulfilling specific needs on both sides. You will understand once I explain the terms." Clara stared at him, still half expecting someone to burst in and shout that this was some sort of elaborate prank. But the way he watched her, steady, unflinching, told her he was absolutely serious. Sebastian reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a slim black folder. He slid it across the polished surface toward her, the motion deliberate, his expression unreadable. "Everything is outlined here," he said, "but I'll summarize." Clara didn't touch the folder. She kept her eyes on him, waiting. "First," he began, his tone clipped, you'll move into my residence. It will be your legal address for the duration of the marriage. Second, we will make public appearances together. Charity events, corporate, dinners, occasional interviews, to present a united front. Her fingers tightened around the arms of her chair, but she said nothing. Third, he continued, our arrangement will remain strictly private. The media, your friends, my associates. No one outside a very small circle will know that. Truth. You will refer to me as your husband, and I will refer to you as my wife. Fourth, there will be no emotional involvement. This is a contract, not a romance. Clara almost laughed at the bluntness, but the way his voice held not even a hint of hesitation told her he wasn't exaggerating. And in exchange, she asked. In exchange, he said, leaning forward slightly, you will receive a substantial monthly allowance, full coverage of your living expenses, and a payout upon completion of the agreed term. You'll also have access to resources that could make certain personal matters easier for you. She caught the subtle weight in those last words. He knew about her brother. She wasn't sure whether to be grateful or furious. This is insane, she said finally. It's practical, he corrected, and it's your choice. Clara pushed the folder back toward him. No, absolutely not. Sebastian didn't flinch. You might want to think this through before you decide. I don't need to think it through, she said, rising from her chair. I don't marry strangers. Especially not for whatever this is. An opportunity, he replied evenly. An insult, she countered, her voice sharper than she intended. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight shrug, as if her refusal barely registered. Very well. My assistant will see you out. Clara turned and walked toward the door, her steps quick, her pulse still pounding. She had almost reached the elevator when her phone rang. One glance at the screen froze her in place. The hospital. She answered, her voice tight. Hello, Miss Hale. It was a nurse, her tone professional but urgent. It's about your brother. His condition has worsened. We need you here immediately. And there are treatment costs that, well, they'll need authorization before we proceed. Clara's stomach dropped. How much? The figure the nurse gave made her knees weaken. She didn't even have a fraction of it. Her mind raced. Double shifts, overtime, selling what little they owned. It wouldn't be enough. Not in time. She murmured that she was on her way and hung up, her hand shaking. Through the glass walls of the lobby, she could still see the city stretched out in every direction. Endless, cold, indifferent. And in the office she'd just left, she knew there was one man with both the power and the means to change everything, if she was willing to pay his price. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and rain-soaked coats, a far cry from the grand weddings Clara had seen in magazines. There were no flowers, no music, no smiling relatives gathered to witness the moment. Just two men in expensive suits, Sebastian's witnesses, standing at the back of the room, speaking in low voices. They didn't so much as glance at her. Clara sat in the hard wooden chair, clutching the small clutch bag in her lap like it might steady her nerves. Across the aisle, Sebastian stood tall, hands clasped loosely in front of him, the dark fabric of his suit absorbing the muted light from the narrow windows. His expression gave nothing away. The officiant, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses, shuffled through a stack of papers. "We'll keep this brief," he said, in a tone that made it sound more like a transaction than a union. Brief. Clara supposed that was fitting. This wasn't a love story, at least not the kind she'd grown up reading about. This was a contract, a set of terms she had agreed to, only because the alternative meant losing the only family she had left. "Please stand," the officiant said. Sebastian stepped forward, and Clara followed, her heels clicking against the worn tile. Her heart beat unevenly, not from romance, but from the sheer strangeness of it all. Marrying a man whose touch she had never felt, whose life was a world apart from her own. The vows were standard, spoken in low, even voices. Sebastian's tone didn't falter once. When it was her turn, she stumbled over the word husband, the sound foreign on her tongue. The officiant handed them each a pen to sign the marriage license. Sebastian's signature was quick, precise, a flourish at the end like he was closing a lucrative deal. Clara's hand trembled as she signed beneath his. "You may shake hands," the officiant said with a faint smile, clearly aware of the absence of a kiss. Sebastian extended his hand. She took it, the contact brief and cool. No one clapped. No one smiled. The witnesses gathered the paperwork and walked out without a word. Clara stood there for a moment longer, realizing that in less than 10 minutes she had gone from Clara Hale to Mrs. Sebastian Knight, and no one in her life even knew. Outside, the day had turned the color of steel. Rain fell in steady sheets, pooling along the curb and turning the courthouse steps slick. Clara paused beneath the stone archway, hugging her small bag to her ribs while she measured the distance to the waiting car. It wasn't far, but the wind pressed the rain sideways, the kind that found every gap and seam. Sebastian stepped up beside her without a word and lifted an umbrella. It was large enough to cover them both if she moved closer, but she stayed half, a pace back on instinct, unwilling to presume more than what had been agreed. He angled the canopy anyway, tilting it so that the drops slid off the anyway far edge, and kept her dry while his shoulder darkened with water. They started down the stairs. His hand hovered at her elbow, not quite touching, as if he were prepared to steady her but wouldn't assume the right. The street hissed with passing tires. A bus rumbled through a puddle and sent a low wave toward the sidewalk. Sebastian shifted, placing himself between her and the splash. It caught his shoe and the hem of his trousers. Clara's skirt stayed dry. "Thank you," she said, barely louder than the rain. He nodded once. "Watch the next step. It's uneven." He remembered details like that. She wasn't sure whether to find it reassuring or unnerving. At the bottom of the stairs, a gust slipped beneath the umbrella and lifted loose strands of her hair across her mouth. She tucked them behind her ear and realized how quiet he was. Not cold exactly, more like someone who had spent years measuring what he gave away. They reached the curb. The driver hurried around the car with his own umbrella, but Sebastian didn't lower his. He waited until the door was open, then turned the canopy wider over her head so she wouldn't have to duck through the rain. She slid into the leather seat, and he followed, closing the door with a soft final click that sealed the outside world away. For a moment, the car was filled with the rhythmic beat of rain drumming on the roof. The windows blurred with water, the city reduced to shifting grey shapes, and the glow of brake lights. Clara smoothed her skirt over her knees, suddenly aware of the ring on her finger. Simple, unadorned, cool against her skin. It didn't fit the idea of a wedding ring, but then, nothing about this day fit any idea she'd ever held. Sebastian adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, then spoke without looking at her. "The driver will take us to the apartment first. A few documents need your signature there. After that, we'll go to the residence." The residence. He said it like a location on a map, not a home. She nodded. "All right." His eyes shifted to her ring, then to her face. "If at any point you need to stop by your place, say so. We can arrange it." "My place," she echoed, and had to swallow once before she could finish. There isn't much to collect. He considered that. The line of his jaw easing a fraction. Still, we'll do it. Silence settled again, not entirely uncomfortable. The driver eased into traffic, and the car moved through the grey afternoon. Clara watched droplets race each other down the window, merging and separating, leaving faint trails that faded as quickly as they formed. At a red light, a couple crossed the street holding a child between them, the three of them sharing a small umbrella. The child jumped a puddle and laughed, a sound muted by glass and rain. Clara felt a tug somewhere under her ribs, something like memory or longing. She couldn't decide. She shifted her gaze to her hands, lacing her fingers together until the feeling settled. Across from her, Sebastian's phone buzzed once. He glanced at the screen, replied with a brief message, then set it face down on the seat beside him. No apology, no explanation. He didn't seem like a man who offered either, yet the umbrella, the wet shoulder, the way he'd placed himself between her and the splash, those were explanations of a different kind. "Are you all right?" he asked, as the car turned onto a quieter street. Clara nodded. "Yes. If you're cold, there's a blanket in the side compartment." She shook her head. "I'm fine." He accepted that, and the car rolled on. She looked back to the courthouse, steps shrinking in the side mirror, the dark archway swallowing the last sliver of light. Somewhere inside, a clerk would file a license that said she was now someone's wife. It felt surreal, like signing for a package that contained a life she hadn't ordered. The light ahead turned green. The car moved forward, the rain steady as a metronome. Sebastian adjusted the umbrella on the floor so it wouldn't drip onto her shoes. He did it quietly, without comment, and returned his hands to his lap. If there was a meaning in the gesture, he left it unspoken. They drove on, two strangers bound by a promise neither had made with their hearts, crossing a city that recognized them only as shapes behind glass. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the space between them held a careful, unfamiliar calm, like standing in a doorway and not yet choosing which room to enter. The courthouse faded from view as the car wove through the rain-slick streets. By the time they reached the apartment, where Clara would collect her things, the downpour had eased into a mist, clinging to everything in a silver sheen. Sebastian didn't follow her inside, remaining in the car while she gathered a small suitcase and a worn backpack. The driver helped her carry them to the trunk, his manner polite but distant. Within minutes, they were back on the road, heading toward a destination she'd only heard referred to as the residence. When they arrived, the building was the sort of place that could only belong to someone with more wealth than most people could imagine. Sleek lines, guarded entrance, the kind of silence that made the air feel heavier. Inside, a private elevator carried them to the top floor, where the apartment opened in a sweep of glass and steel. The view stretched for miles. The city, a network of glowing streets below. On the kitchen counter, a single envelope waited. Sebastian handed it to her, without ceremony. "Marriage certificate," he said. The clerk signed and sealed it before we left. She slid the paper halfway out, catching sight of their names written together in black ink. The sight was strange, almost disorienting. Her identity tied to his now in a way no one could undo without legal interference. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When Sebastian opened it, one of his aides stepped in with a stack of documents for him to review. The man glanced at her, then back at Sebastian. Everything went smoothly at the courthouse. Sebastian nodded. "No issues." The aide smirked faintly. "Well, I suppose tonight will be Interesting for you both. Clara felt heat rush into her cheeks. She opened her mouth, unsure whether to protest or laugh off the remark, but only managed a faint, awkward sound. Her gaze darted to the floor, and she busied herself straightening the edge of the envelope. Sebastian's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest curiosity. He studied her a moment longer before replying to the aide, in a tone that closed the subject entirely. That will be all. The man left quickly. The elevator doors whispered shut behind him, leaving the apartment quiet again. Clara busied herself by setting her bag near the hallway, still avoiding Sebastian's gaze, but she could feel it. The weight of his attention, lingering like a question he hadn't voiced. He didn't press, though. You'll find the guest room prepared, he said simply. We'll go over the schedule for public appearances tomorrow. She nodded, grateful for the change of topic, but her face still burned. The truth was something she had never thought she'd have to admit to anyone, let alone a man like him. Not because she was ashamed, but because it felt too personal, too revealing. And yet, judging by the flicker of intrigue in his eyes, she suspected he had already guessed. The evening settled over the city with a muted glow, streetlights flickering on one by one as the rain finally slowed. Clara stood near the tall windows of the penthouse, looking out at the endless sprawl of lights. Somewhere below, life moved quickly. People heading home, couples rushing under shared umbrellas, children tugging on their parents' hands. It felt strange to know she was now married, yet standing alone in a place that didn't feel like hers. Sebastian stepped away to take a phone call, his voice low and clipped, though she could still hear the steady authority in his tone. She turned her attention back to the glass, following the movement of traffic far below. That was when she saw her. Across the street, leaning casually against a dark sedan, a woman in a vivid red coat stood out against the grey concrete and slick pavement. Even from this height, her posture was unmistakable, poised, self-assured, and patient in a way that felt intentional. She wasn't sheltering from the weather, despite the damp air. Her face was partially obscured by the angle, but Clara noticed the faint glint of something in her hand. A phone. The woman lifted it slowly, angling the lens toward the building. Clara's stomach tightened. She stepped back from the glass instinctively, but the woman didn't lower the phone. She snapped 1, 2, 3 deliberate photos, as though documenting a moment only she understood. Clara's mind raced. Could she be press? Someone connected to Sebastian's business? Or something else entirely? Sebastian's voice cut into her thoughts. Is something wrong? She turned toward him. There's someone outside. She's been watching the building. He walked to the window, scanning the street. But by then, the woman in red had slipped into the passenger seat of the sedan. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the slow stream of traffic until its taillights were just another pair of red dots fading into the distance. She's gone, he said, his tone unreadable. Clara hesitated. You don't think she was... If she was press, he interrupted, we'll know soon enough. Don't concern yourself with it tonight. Easier said than done. As he returned to his desk, Clara glanced once more at the street below. The spot where the woman had stood was empty now, but the image stayed fixed in her mind. The red coat, the steady gaze, the deliberate way she had aimed her camera. And for the first time since stepping into this arrangement, Clara felt the faint, cold edge of something she couldn't name pressing at the edges of her new life. Clara stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest room, hardly recognizing herself. The gown, a deep emerald satin that shifted with every movement, had arrived in a long black garment bag earlier that afternoon, courtesy of Sebastian's assistant. Its neckline was modest, but the way the fabric curved around her frame made it impossible to ignore the quiet elegance it carried. She smoothed her hands down the skirt, the material cool beneath her fingers. It wasn't the kind of dress she'd ever have chosen for herself, but something about wearing it made her stand taller, even if her stomach knotted at the thought of walking into a room filled with people who had more wealth than she could imagine. When the doorbell chimed, she opened it to find Sebastian in a black, tailored suit, the cut sharp enough to make the air feel different. His gaze moved over her once, slow, deliberate, before he extended his hand. "We're late." The car ride to the hotel was quiet. Outside, the city lights blurred in long streaks, and inside, the silence felt neither strained nor comfortable, simply charged. He didn't speak until they stepped out into the bright entrance of the Grand Marlowe Hotel, where a line of luxury cars curved toward the gold-trimmed doors. Inside, chandeliers glowed overhead, casting the ballroom in warm light. Glass walls revealed a nighttime cityscape beyond, while the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume lingered in the air. Men in tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns moved in tight circles, exchanging polite laughter over champagne flutes. Clara followed a half step behind Sebastian as they entered, feeling dozens of eyes turned toward them. His presence seemed to command attention, without him having to ask for it. People parted slightly as they walked, greeting him with firm handshakes and measured smiles. She kept her own expression calm, her gaze steady, even as she felt the weight of scrutiny settle on her shoulders. It wasn't hostility exactly, more curiosity. The unspoken "who is she" floated in the air, though no one voiced it aloud. A waiter approached with a silver tray, and Sebastian took 2 glasses of champagne, handing one to her, without looking away from the investor who had just stepped forward to speak with him. Clara listened quietly, her fingers wrapped around the stem of the glass, noting how quickly the conversation moved from polite pleasantries to the crisp language of profit margins and quarterly projections. Then came the first ripple of tension. A pair of investors, one older, one in his 40s, began speaking over one another, their voices rising just enough to draw subtle glances from nearby guests. Sebastian's jaw tightened, and he started to step forward, but Clara's hand touched his arm lightly, stopping him. "Let me," she murmured. Before he could respond, she turned to the 2 men, her voice calm but firm. "Gentlemen, perhaps I'm misunderstanding, but it sounds as though you're both describing the same goal, just from different angles." They paused, both caught off guard by her tone. She continued, asking them questions that reframed their points, drawing attention to their shared interests rather than their differences. By the time she stepped back, they were nodding in agreement, each claiming the other had made a valid point. Sebastian didn't say anything, but when she glanced at him, his gaze was different, warmer, sharper, as if he was seeing something new. The disagreement flared near the donor's display, where a sleek model of Knight Global's new logistics hub sat under glass. 2 investors stood toe-to-toe Mr. Larkin, a silver-haired veteran of shipping, and Amir Patel, a younger fund manager known for aggressive timelines. Voices stayed low, but the tension drew a small ring of watchers who pretended to study the exhibit while listening closely. "It's wasteful," Larkin said, tapping the glass above the miniature cranes. "You're adding redundant capacity on the lakefront when the rail corridor already gives you reach. We should consolidate, not expand." Patel shook his head. "Redundant? It's resilience. One storm and your rail line stalls. A second hub splits the risk and shortens last-mile delivery by 12%. The math is simple. Your math ignores unions and permits," Larkin countered. "You'll be tangled for 18 months. Sebastian shifted forward, that familiar gravity in his stance. Clara felt his movement and stepped with him. Then, gently, she touched his sleeve. He glanced down. She gave a small nod. "Let me try." She turned to the men with a steady smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm still learning the landscape, but may I ask a clarifying question?" Both men paused, caught between offense and curiosity. Clara gestured to the model. "Mr. Larkin, your concern is time lost to approvals, yes? And, Mr. Patel, yours is time lost to disruptions. It sounds like you both care about keeping shipments moving with fewer surprises." Patel's mouth twitched. "That's one way to frame it. Then what if you test both realities without committing to the full build?" Clara continued, voice even. "A pilot. Lease a smaller waterfront parcel for 12 months. Outfit it with temporary equipment and route only seasonal overflow through it. Meanwhile, keep the equipment rail corridor as the primary artery. You'd get real data on permitting speed, labor coordination, and weather delays, without the upfront spend of a permanent hub." A few heads turned, listening now. Larkin folded his arms. "Temporary equipment can't mirror a true build." "Not perfectly," Clara agreed, "but it reveals the friction points you're worried about. How long the approvals take, how crews integrate, where bottlenecks form. If the pilot underperforms, you've lost a year's lease and gained a map of what not to do. If it outperforms, you've de-risked the bigger decision and negotiated from experience, not assumptions." Patel's eyes narrowed, but with interest. "And the 12%? You measure it," Clara said. "Set a clean target before you start. Say, a 10% improvement on delivery time for pilot-routed orders. If the pilot hits it or exceeds it, you have your case. If not, Mr. Larkin's consolidation view gets the nod." She looked between them. "It keeps both of you honest and protects shareholders from a guess. You're arguing the future on principles. Run a year and let the numbers settle it." The small circle around them loosened, a ripple of low approval passing through it. Larkin's stance softened. "A sunset clause and defined metrics," he murmured. "I could live with that." Patel gave a short, reluctant smile. "As long as we pre-select customers who can handle flexible routing. No sense testing with clients who need static timetables." "That's fair," Clara said. "Pick partners who'll treat it like an experiment and document everything. Wins, failures, the hidden headaches no one warns you about." A woman with pearl earrings, Mrs. Weatherby, stepped closer, her expression bright, sensible. "You've saved us an hour of circular debate." Clara exhaled quietly, only then realizing she'd been holding her breath. She glanced at Sebastian. He hadn't stepped in once. He hadn't needed to. But the look he gave her now felt different. Steady, approving, with warmth threaded through its cool composure. Patel extended a hand to Larkin. "Pilot, pilot," Larkin agreed, shaking once. A staffer drifted by with a tray of champagne. Mrs. Weatherby plucked 2 flutes and offered one to Clara. "For the peacemaker," she said. "Night Global could use more voices that cut through noise." Clara accepted with a grateful smile. "Thank you." As the small crowd broke apart, Sebastian moved to her side. He didn't touch her. He rarely did in public unless strategy required it, but his voice was low enough for only her to hear. "You asked the right question." "Which one?" "What they were actually afraid of," he said. "You put it on the table and gave them a way to test it without losing face." Clara looked out across the ballroom. where conversation had shifted back to easier topics. "Sometimes people don't need a win," she said softly. "They need a safe way to discover they were right or wrong." He studied her profile for a beat, something thoughtful settling in his eyes. Noted, a string quartet eased into a classic standard. Guests drifted toward the dance floor. In the distance, cameras flashed as a politician arrived. A few heads turned, then turned back. The temperature of the room had changed in a small, important way. Tension dispersed, attention redirected. The kind of shift that keeps an evening smooth when it might have soured. Clara took a small sip of champagne and set the glass on a passing tray. She wasn't used to being noticed for anything other than competence, and even that notice often came quietly. Here, among the city's power brokers, her voice had landed without apology. It felt unfamiliar. It also felt good. "Walk with me," Sebastian said. She fell into step beside him, aware that eyes followed, not with suspicion now, but with interest that bordered on respect. The night wasn't over, but a corner had turned, and both of them felt it. They moved away from the donor's display toward the quieter edge of the ballroom, where tall windows framed the city skyline in 1,000 points of light. Sebastian's hand rested lightly at the small of her back. Not quite a claim, but enough to guide her through the flow of guests with ease. Clara could feel the shift in him. He wasn't scanning the room for the next conversation or mentally measuring the value of every interaction. His attention was here, anchored on her, as if the earlier moment had rearranged something in his mind. They stopped near a low table, draped in ivory linen. A waiter approached, offering fresh glasses of champagne. Sebastian accepted two and handed one to her without breaking eye contact. "You handled them well," he said. "It wasn't hard," she replied, keeping her voice casual. They weren't really arguing about the project. They were arguing about risk. Once you name it, it's easier to talk about. He studied her for a moment, his gaze steady, the edges softer than usual. "Most people don't see that." She lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. "I've had practice reading people. It's useful when you need to talk to your landlord and keep your job in the same week." There was no pity in his expression, no patronizing sympathy, just a warmth that seemed to settle behind his eyes, as though he was filing away every word she said for later. Around them, conversations ebbed and swelled. Waiters passed with trays of canapes, and the quartet shifted into a slower melody. But the air between them felt more private than the room allowed. For a man known for his precision and cool detachment, Sebastian's expression now carried something else entirely. It wasn't obvious to the casual onlooker. He wasn't smiling, and his posture remained perfectly composed. But there was an attentiveness in him that hadn't been there before. Clara noticed, and the realization sent a quiet ripple through her. This was the same man who had offered her marriage like a business arrangement, who had made it clear he had no interest in anything beyond appearances. And yet, here he was, looking at her as though she'd surprised him in the best possible way. "Sebastian," she began, unsure what she meant to follow it with. He tilted his head slightly. "Yes?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing. Just thank you for bringing me tonight." His mouth curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something close. "You earned your place here on your own." I just opened the door. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the ballroom faded in her awareness, replaced by the slow, steady beat of her own pulse. If she didn't know better, she would have thought his gaze lingered a second too long, on the curve of her jaw, the way the light from the chandelier caught in her hair. And maybe it did. Whatever it was, it made her glance away first. They had just stepped toward the dessert tables when a familiar voice cut through the soft murmur of the crowd. "Clara?" She turned, and her face lit instantly. "Noah?" A tall man in a tailored navy suit was making his way toward her, his grin wide enough to draw glances from the guests he passed. He reached her in 3 long strides, and before she could think, he had wrapped her in a warm, easy hug, the kind that spoke of years, not months, of friendship. Sebastian's eyes sharpened. Clara stepped back, smiling. "I didn't know you were in the city." "Flew in yesterday," Noah said, hands still resting lightly on her arms. "I'm here consulting for a logistics firm. They dragged me to this thing as part of the charm offensive." His tone was playful, his attention entirely on her. Sebastian's hand shifted to the inside of his pocket. To anyone else, he looked perfectly at ease, his stance relaxed, his expression unreadable. But Clara, who had started to notice the subtle ways he measured people, could feel the tension under the surface. Noah glanced at Sebastian and extended a hand. "And you must be Sebastian Knight," Sebastian said smoothly, his handshake firm. "Husband." Clara's breath caught at the faint edge in his voice, so mild it could be dismissed as nothing, unless you knew him well enough to hear the quiet steel behind it. Noah's brows lifted, then he smiled. "Of course. Clara mentioned she was married, but I didn't realize." "She mentioned me," Sebastian interrupted, still polite. "Only in passing," Noah said, unaware of the subtle shift happening between them. "We were in school together. She got me through more exams than I care to admit." Sebastian's gaze flicked to Clara, assessing, before returning to Noah. "I'm sure she did." Clara cleared her throat. Noah's being dramatic. "We just studied together." Noah chuckled, then leaned in to speak to her quietly. "I'd love to catch up before I leave. Maybe coffee?" Sebastian didn't move, but the air beside her felt denser, as though he'd drawn just slightly closer. "That depends on our schedule," Clara said quickly, glancing at Sebastian. Sebastian's expression remained courteous, though his next words carried weight. "We'll see what we can arrange." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Clara could sense the current running beneath Sebastian's calm. When Noah excused himself to greet another guest, Sebastian's gaze followed him for a second too long. She turned to him. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Just interesting." "Interesting?" His eyes met hers, steady. "The people you let that close." There was no accusation, just observation, but it hummed with a quiet intensity she couldn't quite name. And for the rest of the evening, when Sebastian's hand found the small of her back, or his eyes lingered, across the room, the gesture felt less like polite direction and more like silent possession. The penthouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt untouched for hours. The city stretched out below, its late-night hum muffled by glass walls. Clara padded barefoot into the kitchen, pulling her cardigan tighter around her thin cotton pajamas. She hadn't been able to sleep. Her mind was too restless. The gala had left her buzzing with energy, replaying the way Sebastian had looked at her, and the way he'd watched Noah. She set a small pot of water on the stove, pulling a tin of chamomile from the cabinet. Tea had always been her solution to everything. Late-night study sessions, headaches, long shifts that left her hands aching. The scent grounded her, reminded her of home. She was reaching for the sugar jar when she heard the faintest sound, a low click of shoes against marble. She turned, and there he was. Sebastian stood in the doorway, not in his suit, but in dark sweatpants and a plain t-shirt that fit just enough to hint at the lines of his frame. His hair was slightly tousled, as though he'd run a hand through it more than once. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. his voice lower than usual in the quiet. She shook her head. Too much. In my head. He stepped into the kitchen, moving toward the counter. Chamomile? She nodded. It helps. He reached for the sugar, at the same time she did, and their fingers brushed lightly over the spoon's handle. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent an odd current up her arm. She pulled her hand back, only to realize he hadn't moved his quite as quickly. Sorry, she murmured. No need, he replied, tone smooth, as if the contact had been nothing, though something in his eyes suggested he'd noticed it just as much as she had. She busied herself pouring the hot water over the tea, steam rising between them. He leaned against the counter, watching her with the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. You always make it this way? He asked. This way, with the leaves measured, the water temperature right. Most people just drop a bag in a mug and call it done. She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. Old habits. When you grow up having to make every grocery dollar count, you learn not to waste things by rushing them. He said nothing for a moment, as though weighing that detail about her. Interesting, he finally said. And it wasn't just about the tea. She wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth soaking into her palms. He was still standing close enough that she could catch the faint scent of his cologne, softened by the hour. Do you usually walk into people's kitchens in the middle of the night? She asked, half teasing. He smirked, faintly. Only when I hear the cupboards open. Sound carries in here. Maybe I'll keep that in mind, she replied, sipping her tea. His gaze lingered a moment longer. Then he reached past her to take a bottle of water from the fridge. The movement brought him close enough that his arm brushed her shoulder, a casual contact that didn't feel casual at all. Good night, Clara, he said, his voice just above a whisper. She watched him leave, the sound of his steps fading into the hallway, and found herself more awake than before. Morning came with a pale wash of light over the skyline. Clara woke later than planned and found a note on the kitchen island in neat, decisive handwriting. Breakfast in the warmer. Meeting at 9. If you need the car, text Mateo. She smiled despite herself and lifted the lid. 2 small omelets, still warm, and a slice of toast cut into exact halves. She ate standing by the window, then hurried to dress. Simple blouse, soft slacks, hair pulled back. She didn't expect to see him before noon. He was always in the office, before most people had left their first cup of coffee. Yet, as she stepped into the hallway with a stack of mail, the concierge had sent up. Sebastian emerged from his study at that exact moment, sleeves rolled to his forearms, phone to his ear. He paused, took in the envelopes, and ended the call with 2 words. Send the brief. Mail? He asked. Looks like it, she said. Some are for your office. I'll take them, he said, crossing the distance. His fingers brushed hers as he relieved her of the stack. Cool skin, precise motion, nothing accidental, except it felt exactly that. He glanced at the top envelope. Mrs. Knight. It read. His eyes flicked to hers for the briefest beat, something unreadable passing there, and then he turned away with the mail, as if the moment hadn't lingered at all. An hour later, Clara stood in the walk-in pantry, trying to make sense of shelves arranged like a showroom. She searched for rice. The labels faced forward in perfect rows. Jasmine, basmati, short, grain, wild. All decanted into glass canisters with chrome scoops, looking for something. His voice came from the doorway. She startled. Do you always appear when someone is about to commit culinary crimes in your kitchen? Only when I hear the distinct sound of indecision, he said. Left side. Second shelf. She turned. There are 3 second shelves. He stepped in, reaching past her to tap the correct container. This one. His arm brushed her shoulder again, the lightest contact, and he didn't move away immediately. You'll also want the stock. Top shelf. She looked up. That one is 2 feet above my reach. He opened a slim ladder from a closet, set it in place, and offered a hand for balance as she climbed 1 step. She didn't need it. Not really, but she took it anyway. His palm was steady and warm. When she came down with the box of stock, he didn't let go quite as quickly as necessary. "Thank you," she said, a little breathless for no good reason. "Consider it preventative maintenance," he replied, folding the ladder. "I prefer my residence uninjured." "Residence?" she echoed, amused. "You make it sound like a hotel." "Sometimes it feels like one," he said, but his eyes stayed on her, thoughtful, as if he were weighing whether to add something more. By midday, Clara had settled at the long dining table with her laptop to sort a mountain of insurance forms for her brother. The runners on the table had no wrinkles. The pencils in the drawer were all sharpened to the same length. Every so often, the elevator whispered open and closed as staff came and went, quiet as cats. At 1, Sebastian appeared again. He set a small lunch tray beside her, grilled chicken, salad, a cup of fruit, and leaned a hip against the table. "You didn't have to," she said. "I did," he countered mildly. "You haven't moved in 90 minutes. She laughed softly. "I lost track." He angled his head toward the forms. "I can have legal look at those." "I've got it," she said quickly, then added, "Thank you, though." His gaze dropped to the name on the top page. "Eli Hale, my brother." He nodded. "Right." A pause. "What does he like?" She blinked. "Like food, music, things," he clarified. "If he's coming home soon, we'll make sure whatever he needs is already there." The "we" wasn't missed. It was said casually, but it landed in her chest with surprising weight. "He likes cinnamon rolls," she said, almost without thinking. He always did. "And those cheap headphones that somehow don't break." Sebastian's mouth tilted. "Noted." He left, and she told herself the timing of his appearances was coincidence. A large home like this had a rhythm of its own. Paths crossed. That was all, except it kept happening. She finished the forms and decided to explore the rest of the penthouse. The private library was at the far end of the hall. Dark wood, a ladder on rails, a faint hint of leather and old paper. She ran her fingers along the spines. History, economics, rare editions of classics. Tucked between them, unexpectedly, a slim book on caregiving sat like a misplaced guest. She pulled it out. A note fell from inside, in the same neat hand as the morning's message. It read, "Page 42. Good list for nighttime routines." Her heart thudded once, hard. She thumbed to the page. Soft checklists, breathing exercises, a reminder to set alarms for medications. The note wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. "Found it?" he asked from the doorway. She turned. "Do you live in the walls?" "Only on weekdays," he said, and she laughed despite herself. He stepped into the room, hands in his pockets. "You can borrow anything. If you want a desk in here, we'll have one brought up." "I'm fine at the dining table," she said. But the thought of a small desk in this quiet room stayed with her. He nodded once, as if he'd heard the unspoken part. That afternoon, Clara attempted the gym on the lower level, something she had no real plan for, except that the space existed and going anywhere else felt like trespassing. She climbed onto the treadmill and set it to a cautious pace. 2 minutes in, the door opened. Sebastian walked in, traded his watch for a towel, and stepped onto the machine beside hers. "Coincidence?" she asked, not looking over. "Entirely," he said. "Unless you believe I schedule my workouts around your calendar." She found a smile. "Do you?" He pressed a button to increase his speed. "Not yet." They ran in companionable quiet. The screens in front of them displayed the same route through a digital canyon, the same distance counters ticking forward. She realized their strides had fallen into sync, and that awareness made her laugh softly under her breath. He heard it, of course. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "It's just oddly coordinated." He clicked his speed up another notch. "Can't have that. Show off." Guilty. The hour slid by faster than she expected. When she stepped off, he handed her a cool bottle of water. Their fingers met. He didn't move away immediately. His eyes dropped to her mouth for half a heartbeat, so quick she might have imagined it, then returned to hers, as if nothing had happened. Late afternoon brought a delivery. Clara opened the door to find a florist's assistant holding a white box. Inside were cinnamon rolls, still warm, the sugar glaze shining. A small card lay on top. "For Eli's first morning back. Test batch tonight." She stared at the words until they blurred, then closed the box gently. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon for the next hour. When she finally found Sebastian again, this time in the study, she hovered in the doorway, unsure whether to thank him in person or send a message. He looked up. "Well, they're excellent," she said, lying only a little. She hadn't tasted them yet. "He'll love them." "Good," he said, returning to his screen. But as she turned to go, he added, "There's milk in the back of the refrigerator." "The good kind." She laughed. "The good kind? You'll know it when you taste it." Twilight stretched across the windows, the city switching from day to night like a man flipping a switch. Clara took her tea to the balcony and leaned against the railing, the distant sound of traffic threading through the quiet. She told herself the crossing paths were just that, paths in a shared space. She told herself his timing was incidental, his touches accidental, his questions practical. Yet when she went back inside, Sebastian was there in the hallway, as if he'd been waiting for her to reappear, though he said nothing to suggest he had. He simply fell in step beside her, walking toward the kitchen where she had left the box of cinnamon rolls. "Try one," he said, opening the box, purely for research. She took a bite. Sweet, warm, a hint of spice that lingered. She closed her eyes a fraction longer than necessary. When she opened them, he was watching her, not with the cool curiosity she recognized from their first days, but with something that had taken root behind his gaze, steady and intent. "Well?" he asked. She swallowed. "He'll love them," she said again, voice softer now. "Good," Sebastian murmured. And this time the word carried more than approval. It sounded like a quiet promise he had made to himself. The evening settled. The home felt a shade less impersonal, and every place she turned, she found evidence of a pattern she couldn't deny. Hallways, timed perfectly, doors opening just as she reached them, his voice arriving precisely when silence had grown too loud. Excuses, she told herself. Intent. Her pulse answered. The morning started with the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. Clara stirred, reaching for it with a groggy hand. A flood of notifications lit the screen. Messages from an old friend, missed calls from an unfamiliar number, and a text from Sebastian's assistant. "You should see this before he does." Clara sat up, heart kicking. She tapped the link in the message, and the screen filled with the bold black letters of a gossip site headline. CEO's wife caught with mystery man. Sparks trouble in paradise? Below it, a grainy photograph. She recognized the moment instantly. Noah hugging her goodbye outside the gala's valet entrance. The flash of a camera must have caught them mid-embrace, her hand resting lightly on his back. Out of context, it looked intimate. Too intimate. Her pulse rushed in her ears. Noah was an old friend, practically family, someone who'd once sat at her mother's kitchen table, eating burnt pancakes and teasing her for always overcooking eggs. But that history meant nothing to strangers with an appetite for scandal. The article dripped with speculation, calling her mysterious, private, and an unlikely match for New York's most eligible bachelor. The last paragraph suggested Sebastian's silence at the gala after party was telling. She shoved the phone aside and swung her legs over the bed. This was nothing, she told herself. He'd understand. He had to. Except Sebastian wasn't the kind of man who trusted easily. She'd seen it in the way he studied people, the way his jaw tightened when others got too close. The sound of the penthouse elevator sliding open made her skin prickle. She slipped into a loose sweater and headed for the living room. Sebastian was already there, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone was in his hand, the screen dark now, but his expression told her he'd seen the same headline. "Sebastian," she began. He turned. His face was unreadable, but the sharpness in his eyes cut through the distance between them. "Who is he?" Her throat tightened. "A friend. His name is Noah. I've known him since. I didn't ask for his resume." His voice was calm, but there was an edge under it, like a blade hidden beneath smooth cloth. "Why were you with him, outside the gala?" "Alone. In the dark." The framing made her bristle. "Because we were catching up for the first time in years. He was leaving, and we hugged. That's all. Do you realize what this looks like?" "Yes," she said, heat rising in her voice. "I saw the photo. But you, of all people, should know better than to trust what tabloids make up." He took a slow step forward, eyes fixed on hers. "And you, of all people, should know the cost of careless appearances." "We made an agreement, Clara. No scandals, no distractions." Something in her snapped. "I'm not a distraction, Sebastian, and I'm not going to live my life afraid that smiling at someone will ruin your precious image." His jaw clenched, and for a moment he didn't reply. The silence between them thickened, carrying more than just the weight of a headline. The space between them tightened, as if the room had shrunk. Clara folded her arms, more to steady her voice than to protect herself. "You keep saying we made an agreement. It feels more like you made rules and expected me to live inside them." Sebastian's reply was quiet. The quiet that made people lean in. "Those rules keep wolves from the door. I'm not the one feeding them," she shot back. "A hug from an old friend isn't treason." His eyes flicked to her mouth and back. "It's not the hug. It's what it gives people permission to say. They don't care who he is. They care that you're close to him, and not to me." She laughed once, humorless. "Close to you? You hired me to be a solution, not a partner." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I hired you to protect both of us by keeping me on a leash." She stepped toward him. "Tell me the part where I'm allowed to be human." His voice dropped, roughened. "Be human all you want. Be careless, and you take a torch to everything I've built." The words hit hard. She felt anger coil hot and tight in her chest. Everything you've built includes me now. That means you don't get to talk to me like I'm a risk on a spreadsheet. He took another step, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his cheek. Then stop acting like one. Stop treating me like one, she said, each word clear. Noah is a friend. He always has been. He held me when my mother was sick and I didn't know how to breathe. He hugged me goodbye outside a fancy party. That's the story. If you can't trust me with that, what are we doing? Silence stretched for a beat. Something in his face shifted. Less anger, more ache. But he didn't retreat. Trust is expensive, he said finally. I learned that early. I'm not asking for a blank check, Clara said, softer now. I'm asking for the courtesy you give strangers. He stared at her, and for the first time since she'd walked in, she saw the storm under his restraint. Courtesy, he echoed. Is that what you want from me? What I want, she said, throat tight, is for you to believe me when I tell you there's nothing to that photo. What I want is for you to look at me the way you looked at me at the gala and admit it wasn't just pretend. His breath left him in a slow exhale. The set of his shoulders changed. You noticed. How could I not? Her voice was barely above a whisper. You watched me. Like I mattered. He moved then. Not a lunge, not a plan, just forward, until there was no safe distance left. You do, he said, the words low, as if pulled out of him. That's the problem. Then stop treating me like a headline, waiting to happen. Stop giving them an opening, he returned. But the fight had thinned, leaving something raw. His gaze dropped again, lingered, rose. She swallowed. If you're going to accuse me, say it. If you're going to trust me, do that. But don't stand here and... Her sentence broke when his hand lifted, fingers brushing a stray curl behind her ear. The touch was barely there, and somehow everything. Her breath hitched. Sebastian. He stopped, as if the sound of his name had pulled him back to the edge. Tell me to step away, he said, voice rough. Say it, and I will. She didn't. The admission hung between them, like heat. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to turn away. She didn't. The first touch of his mouth was restrained, almost careful, the kind of kiss that asks a question. She answered by rising onto her toes, her hands lifting to his shoulders, fingers curling in the fabric of his t-shirt. The kiss deepened, not hungry, not yet, but deliberate, like a truth they had both been circling. His hand slid to the small of her back, drawing her closer. The scent of him filled her head, clean, faintly warm from sleep, lost to worry. She felt the moment he let go of a fraction of control. The kiss shifted, slow turning to, sure, restraint giving way to something that tasted like relief and possession at once. Clara broke for air first, a shaky breath against his cheek. There's nothing with Noah, she said, the words brushing his skin. I know, he murmured, and the admission landed in her chest like a bell. He kissed her again, slower this time, as if to seal what he'd just said. The second kiss ended with his forehead resting against hers. His heartbeat thudded steady through his chest, matching the pace of her own. For a sliver of time, the world outside the glass walls disappeared. There were no cameras, no headlines, no rules, only the fact of his hands anchoring her and the quiet certainty that she had wanted this more than she'd let herself admit. Then, as quickly as he'd allowed himself to fall into it, Sebastian pulled back. The loss of his touch sent cool air across the place. His palm had warmed at her spine. Her brows knit. Sebastian? He stepped away another pace, gathering control like a coat he'd dropped. The distance returned to his eyes. But now, it looked like armor hastily refitted. Not indifference. "I have calls," he said. Voice even again. "We'll revisit the media issue. After my 11. That's it." Her laugh was disbelieving, soft and wounded at the edges. "You kiss me like that, and walk out." His throat worked. "If I stay, I won't be reasonable." "Maybe reasonable isn't what we need," she said. The words out before she could second-guess them. He closed his eyes a heartbeat, then opened them. Decision set. "Not like this. Not when I'm angry." He reached for his phone on the console, fingers steady now. "Eat something. Don't read comments. I'll be back this afternoon. Sebastian." He was already moving toward the elevator. At the doors, he stopped without turning. "I believe you," he said. Quiet, but clear. "That should have been the first thing I said." The doors opened. He stepped inside and was gone. Clara stood alone in the living room, the view sprawling and bright and meaningless. Her lips still felt warm, her chest light and heavy at once. The headline on her phone waited where she'd left it, but the words had lost their power. Something far more complicated had taken their place. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, closed her eyes, and steadied herself with a slow breath. If this was how trust started for a man like him, reluctant, clumsy, real, then it would never be tidy. It would be earned, argued for, then tested again. Across the glass, the city kept moving. Inside, a single truth pulsed through the quiet. This was no longer just an arrangement, no matter what either of them called it, when the world was listening. The storm rolled in before dusk, low clouds pressing against the windows like a tide. Wind rattled the balcony furniture. Far below, the streets thinned as traffic hurried through sheets of rain. Clara stood at the glass with a mug of tea and tried not to check her phone for new articles. She'd already read enough. Sebastian returned just after 7, hair damp at the temples, coat dark with rain. He set his keys in the tray and glanced at her with that quiet assessment she'd begun to read. Not suspicion, not anymore. Something closer to concern. "Any headlines I need to kill?" he asked, shrugging out of the coat. "Your team's already smothered the worst of it," she said. Mrs. Weatherby called to say the board is advising calm. Clara used the same crisp tone Mrs. Weatherby did, when something awful was being politely ignored. It made him huff a brief laugh. Lightning cracked over the river, a staggered flash that bleached the room white. A beat later, the lights blinked. They steadied. On the second strike, the penthouse went dark. The silence that followed felt sudden, like a held breath. The screens died. The air system stilled. Outside, the city still glowed, but up here, everything paused. Sebastian moved first. "Backup should kick," he began, stopping as nothing hummed to life. "Of course, the generator's in maintenance tonight." He reached for his phone, thumbed the flashlight on, and handed it to Clara. "Stay here. I'll check the breaker." She followed anyway. The utility panel sat in a closet off the service hallway. He tested switches, waited, tested again. Nothing. When he straightened, the beam lit his jawline, the tiny scar beneath his ear, the focus in his eyes. "Whole building?" she asked. "Most likely. So, candles?" Her voice tilted light, inviting him to accept the simple fix there was. He stared at her for a beat, then nodded. "Candles." They found a drawer, lined with column candles and tea lights, unused, as if someone had once planned a dinner party and never held it. Clara arranged a cluster on the kitchen island, while Sebastian set a few in glass cylinders along the living room shelves. The first match flared, then settled to a gentle flame. Warm circles of light spread across marble and glass, softening the edges of the room. The view outside pulsed with lightning. Inside, the glow felt almost old-fashioned. "Refrigerator stays closed," he said, half to himself, as if reciting a checklist. She smiled. "You're very good at emergencies. I prefer them on my schedule." He leaned a shoulder against the island and watched her lower another candle into a holder. "Hungry?" "Always," she said, and his mouth tilted. He pulled a cutting board from the cabinet and opened the pantry by phone light like a man solving a puzzle. Within minutes, he'd set out crackers, olives, a jar of roasted peppers, a wedge of cheese, and, because, he noticed the way her face had changed each time she saw them. Cinnamon rolls under a glass dome. "Field rationing. Deluxe edition," he said, passing her a napkin. They ate standing at the island, close enough that she could feel the warmth of the candle nearest his hand. Wind knocked against the building. Rain traced quick patterns down the glass. Somewhere, on a lower floor, someone laughed through an open balcony door. The moment felt suspended from the speed of the day. "Thank you for this morning," she said quietly. "For believing." "You?" he asked. "For saying it out loud," she corrected. "It mattered." He held her gaze for a long second. Noted. The word had a different temperature now, less clinical, more promise. Another crack of lightning. Farther away this time. The darkness inside didn't change. The quiet did. It settled into something easier. Clara blew out a slow breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Dragged a finger through a trail of sugar on her plate like a child. He noticed everything. "Come on," he said. "If we're stuck without power, we might as well sit somewhere less like an airport lounge." They moved to the living area. The candles he'd placed along the shelves flickered in small, steady halos. The city's glow beyond the glass made a second horizon. He folded himself into the corner of the sofa. She took the opposite end, pulling her legs up, toes tucked beneath the hem of her sweater. For a moment, they said nothing. The world had narrowed to rain and light and the quiet knowledge that they were choosing to stay in the same space when they could as easily have retreated to separate rooms. "Tell me something true," he said. "Not the version you give strangers. Yours." She looked at the candle nearest her, watched wax pool and set. "All right," she said, "but you first." He inclined his head. "Fair." Sebastian rested his forearms on his knees, fingers laced, face turned toward the flicker. Without the usual hum of machines, his voice seemed to carry differently, lower, more intimate, as if the room itself had leaned closer to listen. "I was 8 the first time I figured out I was a photo op," he said, almost conversationally. "My father's company had just secured a contract. There was a celebration. I was dressed like a miniature version of him. People shook my hand and told me I was lucky. I thought so too. Later that night, I said, knocked over a glass. It shattered. I apologized to my mother. She made me apologize to him." He smiled for the staff. "Told them everything was fine. Then in private, told me I should be grateful to be there at all." He paused. The candle flame nudged a shadow across his cheek. "As an adult, I told myself I liked clean lines and quiet rooms because they meant focus. Truth is, mess meant punishment, and quiet meant I could hear trouble coming." Clara's breath eased out slowly. "That's why you hate surprises," she said softly. "I don't hate them." His mouth twitched. "I preempt them." She smiled. despite the ache in her chest. That sounds accurate. He angled his head, studying her. Your turn. Clara tucked a curl behind her ear and let her shoulders drop, an invitation to her own truth. My father left when I was 12. He didn't say goodbye. He just stopped coming home. My mother got 3 jobs. I got 2. The day I turned 16, I learned how to read a pharmacy receipt and a hospital bill in the same afternoon. He didn't look away. He didn't rush her either. Eli was 10, she continued. He used to pretend he wasn't hungry, so I would eat the last piece of toast. When his health started to slide, I told him we were fine, that I had a plan. I didn't, not really. I had shifts. I had a calendar, the wall, and an alarm that woke me up at 4 so I could mop a diner floor before school. Romance belonged to people with a safety net. We had each other and a rent notice stuck under the door some months. The wind pressed a longer sigh against the glass. Sebastian leaned back, but his attention stayed locked on her. You carried more than anyone should, he said. I didn't see it that way. It was just life. You make lists, you cross things off, you sleep when you can. I got good at being useful, being wanted. She caught herself, then nodded to show she meant to say it. Wasn't something I expected. He was quiet for a long beat. I want you, he said, steady as a statement of fact. It wasn't a line. It was the truth dropped with care between them. Heat rose in her cheeks. It wasn't embarrassment so much as recognition. You want me to be… what? Convenient. Presentable. His expression shifted. Seen, he said. Safe. Close. She heard the last word as clearly as if he'd touched her. Close how? The question came out softer than she intended. In all the ways that terrify me, he returned, and the honesty of it felt like a door opening. Silence settled again, but not empty. It was full of things neither had said aloud until now. She curled her toes under the blanket. She'd pulled from the sofa back and watched. The candle throwed tiny arcs of light across his wrist as he turned it. Lightning cracked farther still. The rain softened a shade. Somewhere in the building, a baby woke and cried. Somewhere else, a dog barked twice and quieted. The world carried on. Here, in a room that had finally learned how to hold warmth, the past felt named, if not healed. What do you do, she asked quietly, when the thing you want is also the thing you're not sure you know how to handle? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was almost a whisper. You tell the truth. You ask for patience. You learn. She nodded. Fair. Your turn, he said again, but not as a challenge, as an invitation. She held his gaze. Something else. True. He inclined his head. I've never let anyone close in that way, she said, the words steady now, because she had decided they would be. Not because I'm afraid of intimacy, because I couldn't afford the aftermath if it went wrong. My life has been a balance beam for too long. One wrong step, and someone I love pays. The room didn't shift, but something inside her did. She had said it. She had handed him the reason, without apology. He didn't freeze. He didn't make a joke to dodge the weight of it. He simply listened. Thank you, he said. And somehow, the 2 words reached farther than any speech. Candles burned lower. Wax crept toward glass rims. Clara drew her knees closer. Blanket curved around her shins. People tend to think never is about innocence, she said. For me, it was logistics and choice. Choice. He echoed. I had offers, she admitted, and laughed once at her own phrasing. Not glamorous ones, kind ones. A boy from my apartment building who fixed his aunt's car and wanted to take me to a matinee. A chef from the diner who slipped extra pancakes on my plate after a double shift. But it was always at the edge of another crisis. I couldn't promise anyone their place in my life when even my sleep schedule had to be negotiated with someone else's medication. She pressed the blanket edge between her fingers. I learned to say no, and mean it, because maybe turned into guilt too easily, and I told myself I'd choose when I felt safe, not from fear or chaos. I didn't want my firsts to be about escape. He didn't move, but the space between them changed. You saved them for the right person, he said, not as a claim, as respect. I saved them for the right moment, she corrected gently. The person matters, of course, but I also wanted to look back and know I chose, that it wasn't a reaction to bad news or a last night in a leased apartment. Her mouth tilted. Turns out, you can be practical about your heart, too. He exhaled a small breath, amused and undone at once. You would find a way. She looked at him. And you? What about me? You talk about control like a shield, she said. Is it also a habit you don't know how to put down? His eyes didn't leave hers. Yes, what happens if you put it down? He considered. I risk needing something I can't manage, and if you don't, I risk missing it entirely, he said. His voice made the choice sound simple. It wasn't. That was the point. She shifted, turning to face him fully, one leg tucked beneath her. Sebastian. He mirrored the movement without thinking, knees angling toward hers. Clara, I don't want to be a rule you made, she said, or a solution you bought. I want to be someone you meet in the middle. I don't want to keep you at the edge of my life, he replied, almost before she finished. I want you inside it. The words landed with the solidity of a decision. Wind softened. The candles dipped a little lower. He reached across the space separating them, not to claim, but to offer. His hand hovered open between them. She watched it for a breath, and then laid her hand in his. Warmth traveled up her arm. His thumb traced once along the base of her fingers, a touch so careful it felt like a vow. Tell me if I'm moving too fast, he said. Tell me if I'm moving too slow. Tell me anything, as long as it's real. She smiled. Deal. He stood, drawing her up with him. The blanket slid to the sofa. They stood in the glow of a dozen small flames, faces close enough that she could see the change in his eyes. When she said, I want you too, his breath hitched. It wasn't a sound she could have identified in his boardroom voice. It belonged here, in candlelight, with rain easing beyond the glass, and the world temporarily pushed to the edges of the frame. Clara, he said, the name low, like a promise. Sebastian, she answered. Steady. He didn't rush forward. He closed the distance, the way a careful man does, when he has decided to be brave, measured, attentive, unwilling to risk misunderstanding. When his mouth met hers, the kiss was soft at first, an echo of the morning's heat, but without anger knotted under it. He tilted his head, giving her room to step in or step back. She stepped in. The kiss deepened, not sudden, not careless, surer than before. His hand came to rest at her waist. Hers rose to the line of his jaw. The scruff there rasped lightly against her fingertips, grounding her in a moment that felt both new and long overdue. "Tell me," he murmured when they parted a fraction. "I'm here," she said. "I want this." He didn't need more than that. She could see it in the way his shoulders released a tension he carried like second nature. He kissed her again, slower, and the room seemed to fold around the two of them, smaller and warmer with each breath. They moved together through the candlelight, learning each other's rhythms without hurry. He was and warmer with each breath. They moved together through the candlelight, learning each other's rhythms without hurry. He was careful with every touch, offering, never assuming, his questions asked in the brush of his hand along her arm, in the pause before his lips found her throat, in the way he waited for the slightest nod before taking the next step. She answered with her own language, the soft catch of breath when he cupped her face, the way her fingers sought his wrist, as if to anchor him closer, the quiet yes that left no doubt. "Tell me if anything feels wrong," he said. "It doesn't," she answered, a small laugh in the word because nothing had felt this right in longer than she could remember. He lifted her gently, and the sofa became a place too narrow for what the moment was turning into. They crossed the room as a single thought, his hand steady at her back, hers splayed over his heart. In the doorway to the bedroom, she paused, only to look at him, to see if the man who had taught himself to survive control would also learn how to surrender to care. He did. He unlearned a little with each inch, with each breath, with each time he waited for her to nod before he let himself want. The candles from the living room cast soft gold into the hallway. The storm's voice dwindled to a hush that set the pace, slow and sure. She touched his face, traced the small scar at his hairline, mapped the features she had once studied from a distance. "I'm choosing," she whispered, because naming it mattered. "Me too," he said, the words rough but clear. Clothes became another kind of silence between them, the kind you let fall when words do more harm than good. He kept speaking anyway, in the care of his hands, in the patience of each kiss, in the way he stopped, each time, to check the truth in her eyes. She answered, without ambiguity. No performance, no posing, just agreement, repeated, in all the small ways that count. When it finally changed, when closeness turned into closeness of a different order, she closed her eyes, not to hide, but to feel it fully. There was a tenderness to his control now, repurposed, shaped to protect rather than to hold back. He listened for every shift in her breath, adjusted to every sound, learned her reactions, like a language he had always wanted to speak. She guided him when she needed to, unafraid to ask, unafraid to receive. Time lost its edges. The storm outside moved farther down the river. The candles in the other room burned into small cups of light. He pressed his forehead to hers, their noses brushing in a kiss that wasn't about wanting at all, but about recognition. About seeing the person in front of you and being seen back. "I've got you," he said. "I know," she breathed. What followed belonged to them. It wasn't cinematic or rehearsed. It was better for its honest shape. Two people trying, learning, choosing. The steadiness of him, where she needed steadiness. The softness of her, where he had forgotten softness existed. They met in the middle, the way she had asked. He returned to it whenever he drifted too far toward old habits. When it was done, when the room held only their breathing and the slow, quiet that comes after, they didn't reach for speech right away. He gathered her in, pulled the blanket up, made a cradle of his shoulder and chest. She tucked closer, one leg crossing his, hand finding the thud of his pulse. The world still had headlines and rivals and board members with opinions. None of them were here. The electricity returned with a sudden click somewhere down the hall. The lights in the bedroom stayed off. Neither moved. The candles would gutter out on their own. Morning would be busy. There would be consequences. And, across all of it, the question of what this meant now that it had been claimed with intention. Clara lifted her head and looked at him. At the man who had promised to be reasonable and discovered something better than reason. "Are you all right?" she asked. The same words she'd used after the gala, after the kiss. He smiled. That rare, unguarded curve she had learned to love. "I don't think all right covers it." She laughed under her breath and settled again. "Good." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Sleep," he said. "We'll handle the rest when the sun's up." "Together," she said. "Together," he confirmed. The rain loosened its hold on the city. In the dark room, watched only by a line of faint candlelight from the hall, they finally slept. No contracts in the bed with them, no rules except the ones they chose. The storm had forced the lights out. The night had done the rest. Morning arrived like a quiet apology from the sky. Clean light, clear streets, the last drops of rain clinging to the balcony rail. Clara woke to the calm weight of an arm around her waist and the steady lift of Sebastian's breathing against her back. For a few seconds, she kept her eyes closed, memorizing the feel of safety in a space that had never felt like hers until now. He stirred. The arm tightened, just a fraction, as if testing whether she would slip away. She didn't. "Good morning," he said, voice low with sleep. She turned, tucked closer, and let the shy smile come. "Good morning." No speeches followed, no labels. Just a long moment where their foreheads touched and the room held them gently. Eventually she stretched, kissed his jaw, and sat up, pulling the blanket with her. "I'm making coffee," she said, pushing hair behind her ear. "Come claim your share before I drink it all." He smiled. An actual smile, loose and unguarded, the kind that softened the hard lines at his mouth. Threat noted. They dressed without ceremony. Her in a soft tee and joggers, him in a Henley and dark lounge pants. The penthouse felt different as they crossed it. Not smaller, exactly, but less like a display room, and more like a place where life could happen without asking permission. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and reached for mugs. He moved beside her to grind beans, near enough that their shoulders bumped once, twice, making both of them laugh under their breath. The normalcy of it, quiet footsteps, clink of ceramic, the first curl of steam, stitched the night to the morning. He slid a plate toward her. "You have two choices, responsible breakfast or leftover bakery diplomacy." Under a glass dome, one cinnamon roll waited, haloed by glaze. She feigned deep consideration. "Diplomacy, please." He warmed it, tore it in half, and passed her the better piece without pretending not to. They ate at the island, knees almost touching on the stools. Every so often their eyes met. Every time, the glance held a new ease. "Last night," he began, then stopped. As if the sentence had too many doors, she spared him the maze. No regrets. Relief flickered through him so quickly she might have missed it if she hadn't been looking. "Good." "Neither do I." Her phone vibrated. A message from the hospital, routine update, stable vitals, medication adjusted. She exhaled, tension leaving her shoulders in a visible wave. "Good news?" he asked. She nodded, showing him the screen. Better dosage. He slept through the storm. "Thank God," he said, and meant it. A second buzz, this one from his assistant, flashed on his wrist device. Reminder, 10:30 board prep. 11 strategy session. He silenced it. Later. You have a full day, she said, not as a warning, more as a reality check. I have a flexible one, he countered, stirring his coffee. We're fully operational again. I can attend by video. You hate video, she said, amused. I dislike wasted motion, he corrected, tipping his mug toward her in a mock toast. Different thing. They finished breakfast with the kind of small talk that mattered more for its tone than its content, whether the gym needed softer towels, whether the housekeeper liked the new supplier, whether the balcony herbs survived the wind. Domestic details. He took exactly one note on his phone. Towels. And Clara had the absurd, wonderful thought that he would actually fix it. When she stood to rinse the mugs, he reached over her shoulder and took them, fingers brushing the inside of her wrist. She felt the spark of recognition again. This man could be exacting and still gentle, could be demanding and still listen. I'll clean, he said. You cooked, she replied. Let me. You negotiated a peace treaty with breakfast, he said, meaning the part where she'd declared no regrets. I can handle a sink. She laughed, surrendered the mugs, and turned to lean on the counter. The city outside glittered in the washed light. Inside, something steady took root between them, a promise they hadn't spoken, but both felt. He angled toward her, one hand braced on the counter by her hip, close, without crowding. Clara, she hummed in answer. If anything about last night felt rushed, tell me, he said. I'll hear it. It didn't, she said, and added, because truth deserved clarity, it felt chosen. His gaze warmed. He bent, pressed a slow kiss to her temple, and returned to the sink before the moment could become ceremonial. The elevator chimed softly in the hallway. Delivery of the morning papers. Sebastian ignored it. Another buzz landed on his wrist. He ignored that, too. She noticed. Of course. You're going to be late. I'm aware. His tone was mild, almost playful. Tragic. Sebastian. He dried his hands, wiped the counter, and claimed the stool beside her again. Stay home today, he said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, even though the suggestion clearly carried weight. Rest. Read. I'll clear the schedule where it can be cleared. Is this you being protective or possessive? She asked, only half teasing. He met her question head on. Both, he said. I'm working on refining the healthy versions. She held his gaze. Okay. But if you start treating me like a glass ornament, I'm staging a mutiny. Duly warned. Her phone lit once more with a message from her old friend. Just a line. Here, if you need me. She glanced at it and tucked the phone face down. Neutral as a coin. Sebastian didn't ask. He lifted his coffee instead, as if trust were a muscle he meant to exercise without spectacle. Walk with me later, he asked. Rooftop. No cameras. She smiled. I'd like that. They sat a minute longer, doing nothing, letting the quiet be comfortable. The room held their silence, the way a good book holds a thumb between pages, ready to return, not afraid to pause. When at last she slid from the stool, her hand passed near his shoulder. He caught it and pressed a kiss to her knuckles before letting go. Go shower, he said. I'll set up in the study. You mean pretend to work within hearing distance, she said. He looked properly offended. I plan to be extremely productive while remaining within a 30-foot radius of you. She rolled her eyes. Warm all over. Try not to miss your very important meetings. I'll send my regrets, he said, and the faint smile that chased the words told her he meant to do exactly that. By 9:40, the study lights were on, the door open, and Sebastian's laptop arrayed with 3 tidy windows, financials, agenda, and a video call grid waiting for participants. A calendar alert pulsed in the corner. He clicked it away and typed a short message to his assistant. Reschedule 10:30. Power issues. Prioritize the afternoon. She replied, understood within seconds, followed by board chair, asks if everything's okay. He sent back, everything is fine. Clara walked past the door, hair damp, wearing soft denim and an oversized cardigan that fell off one shoulder. He tracked her, in his periphery, the way a hawk tracks movement on the ground, silent, precise, certain. She caught him and smiled without stopping. He pretended to refocus on the spreadsheet and failed convincingly. He opened a blank note and wrote without thinking, order softer towels, call hospital at noon, ask Clara about garden box for balcony, find recipe for cinnamon rolls that freeze well. He deleted the last line, then rewrote it, then left it there. At 10:30, his assistant pinged. We can start without you and loop you in at the vote. He typed proceed and muted his device. The room hummed with nothing. He realized only then how used he'd grown to noise. Meetings, calls, the constant tempo of decision. Today, the quiet felt earned. Clara settled at the dining table with a half stack of paperwork, glasses perched low, on her nose, as she cross-checked discharge instructions against insurance forms. Every few minutes, she paused and sipped water. Every few minutes, he looked up, because he could. A news link arrived from PR. Coverage still circulating. New angles trying to ignite. He thumbed it open, skimmed, and felt his jaw tighten. Wife embraces unidentified man at gala exit. Insiders wonder if contract is coming apart. He could call the editor, threaten access, demand a correction. Moves he had used like tools since he was 25. None of those tactics sounded right in the room where she sat, backlit by the pale morning, nibbling a corner of toast while doing the kind of work that keeps a life from slipping through cracks. He forwarded the link to PR with a single instruction. Ignore. Do not amplify. They replied, surprised but obedient. Copy that. He stood, stretched, and walked out to the table. Status. On hold, she said, tapping a form, waiting for a call back from the case manager. I think we can push for home therapy twice a week, instead of once. We'll get it, he said. If they deny it, I'll underwrite a private plan until insurance catches up. She searched his face. You don't have to fix everything. I know, he said, and almost smiled. I get to choose which things I try to fix. Her phone lit with a text. She glanced, typed a quick reply. All good. Thank you. He did not ask to whom. Trust. Again. It didn't mean the protective ache under his ribs softened. It meant he stood it. Hungry? He asked. Always, she echoed from earlier. He disappeared for 5 minutes and returned with a small plate, sliced apple, almond butter, 2 squares of dark chocolate. He set it by her elbow as if offering a strategy. She looked up at him, and the look was everything breakfast had been, with a little more gravity. He tried to walk back to the study, and only made it as far as the door before turning to watch her take the first bite. She caught him. He didn't even pretend to be sheepish. At 11, the board call began without him. His screen flashed with a notification. Vote moved to 3. Chair asks if you will attend then. He typed yes, knowing he might change his mind again. Sebastian, she called. not looking up from the paperwork. "Do you want my opinion on something?" "Always," he said, moving to stand behind her chair. She slid a printed vendor list toward him. "Your events team keeps picking the same 3 caterers. They're safe. They're also forgettable. If you want guests to talk about more than cocktails, find a chef who cooks like they're telling a story." He leaned down to read the names from her angle, close enough for her hair to brush his jaw. "Recommend 1. I don't know any chefs in your circle," she said, "but there's a small kitchen 2 blocks from the hospital. The owner cooks for recovering families twice a week. Simple food, thoughtful. The kind that tastes like someone remembered your name." He wrote it down. No hesitation. Done. The next half hour passed in companionable silence. He typed a few emails, flagged a line in a contract, sent a text to security about media access in the lobby. Every time she left the room to grab a file or refill her glass, he felt an odd hitch in his breathing. Each time she reappeared, the knot eased. It wasn't possessiveness in the cheap sense. It was recognition. He had spent years keeping the world exactly as close as he could control, and now that someone had walked inside his carefully drawn lines, his body was learning a new pattern, measure the space by her nearness. He tried to hide it. He did not try very hard. Around noon, she closed the folder and stretched, soft sigh leaving her lips. "Victory," she announced. "Forms complete. For now." "Reward," he replied, already dialing the elevator for a lunch delivery he'd arranged an hour earlier. "Soup from that kitchen you described." "I guessed correctly, I hope." She blinked. "You've already." "Preventative maintenance," he said, echoing the joke from yesterday, and received the exact smile he'd hoped for. They ate on the balcony, sweaters on, city bright. He asked her what Eli would want in a room at home. She asked him why there were no photographs on his shelves. He said he'd never had anything he wanted to see that often. She said that was changing. When a calendar alert popped again, board pre-brief in 30, he silenced it a second time. She watched him do it. "You're really not going," she said, equal parts touched and exasperated. He considered the truth and gave it to her without spin. "I'd rather be here." "That can't be good governance," she said softly. "That can be tomorrow's problem," he returned, then added, "Because he was learning, I'll call the chair after lunch and own it." "Thank you," she said, which meant, "Thank you for choosing me without pretending you didn't." He collected the bowls, set them in the sink, and braced his hands on the counter, head bowed for a few seconds. When he looked up, she was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, amusement written all over her face. "What?" he asked. "You're terrible at pretending to work." "I'm excellent at it," he said. "I simply prefer more interesting company." She pushed off the frame and walked toward him. He watched every step, like a man counting blessings. When she reached him, she slid her hands into his Henley, palms flat against his chest, and felt the thrum there answer her own. "Careful," he said, voice a shade rougher. "I have a 3 o'clock. "You did," she corrected. "Now you have a walk on the roof with me." "Tragic," he said again, smiling. He shut the laptop, sent one clean message to his assistant. "I'm off grid for the next hour. Tell the chair I'll make it up to him with dinner and data." And set the phone face down. As they stepped into the hallway, he realized something simple and startling. He hadn't taken a full breath since she left the study 10 minutes earlier. The air felt easier now, with her hand in his. It wasn't dependence. It was clarity. He had spent years convincing himself that needing no one made him strong. Today, in the soft gravity of a day he'd chosen to spend within reach of her. Strength looked like the courage to stay where he could feel. They reached the private stairwell to the roof. He opened the door and let her pass first, a small courtesy that felt like a ritual. Sun flared on the landing, bright and clean. He followed, close enough to catch the faint scent of her shampoo, close enough that, for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a set of battles to win. It felt like a life to build, one choice at a time, beginning with this one: stay near. The email arrived mid-afternoon, folded inside a polite note from Sebastian's assistant. Forwarding. For your review. External outreach. L. Clara opened it. A crisp header. Royce Foundation. The message was brief, almost disarmingly so. Mrs. Knight, your voice at the hospital benefit moved our donors. We're launching a city-wide program for families managing long-term care. I'd value your input and hope you'll consider serving as a community advisor. If you're open, I can meet tomorrow at 2 p.m., Hotel Marlowe Lounge. Kellen Royce. She read it twice. Royce. She knew the name. Articles mentioned him. Whenever Sebastian's company announced a win, different tone, different philosophy. Where Sebastian favored steady execution, Kellen preferred splash. Clara glanced toward the study. Sebastian had left the door ajar, laptop open, jacket on the chair. He was on a call, voice low. She set the phone face down. This wasn't a request to model gowns or pose for magazines. It sounded like work that mattered, streamlining paperwork, closing gaps between discharge and at-home care, finding families who kept falling through. She wrote back a single line, happy to hear more. 2 p.m. is fine. When she looked up, Sebastian stood in the doorway. He had a gift for arriving without footsteps when his mind was occupied. His gaze slipped to the phone, then returned to her face. News? He asked. An invitation, she said, from the Royce Foundation. They want help on a family care project. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes cooled a degree. Which project? She passed him the message. He read it once, thumb resting against his jaw. You answered? I said I'd hear him out. She weighed each word. It's what I've been talking about. Making systems humane. He handed the phone back. I know what it is. She waited for the rest. Kellen doesn't make offers without a camera in his pocket, Sebastian said, voice even. He'll want a headline, and a reason to mention our marriage in the same breath as his donation. Clara's first instinct was to defend her own judgment. The second was to look past the warning and ask what he wasn't saying. Is this about optics, she asked, or is this about you and him? Both, he said, not pretending otherwise. He's tried to peel allies away from me for years. If he can't buy them, he baits them. This isn't a board seat, she said, patient. It's a family care program. His eyes softened at the word family, then steadied. You can help families without being framed by his banner. I can also show up and ask questions that matter, she replied, matching his calm. If the program is real, we'll see it. If it's window dressing, we'll see that too. A beat of quiet. He wasn't used to losing a room. She wasn't trying to win one. They simply stood, the two of them, weighing the cost of a meeting against the value of the work. All right, Sebastian said at last. Go. But you're not going alone. She lifted her brows. You're coming to a lounge at 2 in the afternoon? I'll be invisible, he said, which was charming and untrue. And if he wants a photo, he can take one of my back as we leave. Clara let a smile curve. So, noted. He didn't smile in return. He stepped close, thumb skimming her knuckles once. If at any point you want out, say the word. I will, she said, and meant it. The Hotel Marlowe lounge smelled faintly of citrus and old wood. Afternoon light pooled across leather chairs and quiet tables. Kellen Royce stood as they approached, tall, tailored, a navy suit that said taste without risk. He extended a hand to Clara with the easy confidence of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Mrs. Knight, he said warmly, thank you for making time. Clara is good, she replied, taking the seat opposite. Sebastian chose the chair beside her, not across, close enough to signal that conversations about her included her, and that conversations around her included him. Kellen clocked the seating with a quick flick of his gaze and smiled wider. I'll be direct, Kellen began. We've been studying what happens after the discharge paperwork is signed. Families are exhausted. The first 2 weeks at home are chaos. We want to pair each family with a navigator, someone who translates systems, schedules deliveries, arranges meals, checks on siblings. Clara nodded slowly. That would have saved us months. That's why I asked to meet you, he said. Sincere on the surface and smooth under it. You understand the ground level. I can fund a staff. I can fund training. I can't fake what you know. What exactly are you asking? Sebastian said, polite to the point of cool. Advisory. Public-facing when it helps, Kellen replied. A few site visits a month. Listening sessions. I'd like you to be the program's first voice in the community. He slid a brief proposal across the table. Clara skimmed. Budget columns. Hiring plan. Projected outcomes. Someone had done real homework. She flipped to the back. In a box labeled Visibility. A line, Founding Advisor, Clara Knight. Next to it, Joint announcement with Knight Global. Optional, but ideal. She let the page lie open and met Kellen's eyes. If this is about families, the announcement should be about families, she said. Not my last name. Kellen raised his palms. Gracious. Understood. But public trust matters. Your story builds trust. My story is not a product, she said gently. It's a context. I'll lend it where it helps, not where it sells. Kellen's smile didn't falter. Fair. What would make this useful in your view? Simple things done well, she said. A hotline that answers. A checklist that's not written like a tax form. A driver who knows how to carry a wheelchair. And clear guardrails. Money that goes to services, not glossy flyers. He listened, nodding, jotting a note or two. You'd be good at this, he said. Admiration warm, and, she suspected, strategic. Families will trust you, because you lived it. Clara felt Sebastian's glance, a soft weight at her cheek. She didn't need the reminder. She knew the line between help and being used as a headline. What's your timeline? She asked. Pilot next month, Kellen said. Full rollout in the summer. Sebastian spoke then. Crisp. You're moving unusually fast. We've been building in the background, Kellen said. This meeting is about the last 10%. The human layer. The human layer comes first, Sebastian returned, not rising, just stating. And it isn't your last 10%. It's half the project. Kellen's eyes flickered. Agreed, he said smoothly. As if that had been his point, Clara closed the packet. "I'll give you feedback by Friday," she said. "If I advise, it will be on clear terms." "Of course," Kellen said. "I'll have my team draft an outline." She stood. Both men stood with her. Kellen offered his hand again. "Clara." "Thank you, Mr. Royce," she said, shaking it. His palm was cool. The grip lingered a shade longer than necessary. Friendly. Just enough to register in a photographer's lens. Sebastian shifted a half-step closer, and the contact ended. As they walked out, Kellen added in an almost casual tone, "There's a gala in 3 weeks. Pediatric wing endowment. You'd be our ideal keynote." "We'll review the invitation," Sebastian said, the "we" shaped like a shield. Kellen's smile lived in his mouth, not his eyes. "I look forward to your reply." Back in the car, Clara watched the city pass in glass reflections and thought about lists, deliveries, alarms, forms with too many boxes. She could already see how a navigator would help a grandmother translate instructions, or a single father find a ramp that arrived on time. That part was simple. The rest wasn't. "He's courting headlines," Sebastian said, reading her silence as well as any page. "He's courting outcomes too," she countered. "Both can be true. I don't want your name in his press kit." "It didn't have to be," she said, reminding him. "Kind, not sharp." "I told him so." He drummed his fingers once on his knee, caught himself, and stilled. "I'll fund a separate program through our foundation. You can build it without his logo." "Maybe we can do both," she said. "Pilot with him. Measure what works. Then expand here with clean lines." He turned to her. "You trust him?" "I don't," she said. "I trust the need. That's different." He absorbed that, then nodded. Half acceptance, half stubbornness. "If you advise, I'm present." She smiled. "You were present today, and I will be again," he said, unblinking. "Every session, every site visit." "Sebastian, non-negotiable," he said, voice gentle, tone firm. "If he wants to build something worthwhile, he can do it in the light. I'll make sure the light stays on." She considered arguing, and decided not to. It wasn't about ownership. It was about the math of risk he carried in his bones. He had learned early how quickly people traded kindness for advantage. If showing up kept her from being boxed into a narrative, she would take the extra chair at the table. "Fine," she said, "but if you hover, I'm assigning you to carry boxes." He looked genuinely relieved. "I'm good at boxes, and smiling at donors who tell long stories. I can train for that," he said dryly, and reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, in a way that felt less like claim and more like agreement. They spent the evening drafting a list of terms for any role she took: transparent budgets, a family advisory, board with real authority, the option to publish findings whether or not they were flattering. At the bottom, she wrote one more item: no joint press for optics. She underlined it. He nodded. The next week turned into a parade of rooms. Listening sessions in a church basement and a community center with scuffed floors. A round table at a clinic where nurses offered the best ideas in 10-word bursts between patients. At every stop, Kellen appeared. Well-prepared, watchful, impossibly polite. At every stop, Sebastian stood or sat within arm's reach of Clara, not looming, not loud, simply there. People noticed. Of course, some whispered and pointed, then smiled when Sebastian rolled up his sleeves to load cases of nutritional shakes into a van. Others approached Clara directly, ignoring the billion-dollar shadow beside her, and told her how they'd taught themselves to sleep sitting up on hard chairs next to hospital beds. She wrote everything down. When Kellen suggested a photo on the church steps, Sebastian stepped back, angled himself out of frame, and pretended to check his phone. Clara leaned into the group. Families, volunteers, a social worker with tired eyes, and let the shutter click. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about them. It was about the people squeezed into the middle of the shot who had a right to be centered for once. Sebastian started rearranging his calendar in ways that would have alarmed his staff 3 months ago. He skipped a lunch with 2 financiers to sit on a metal folding chair while a grandmother explained how to get a stubborn oxygen machine to behave. He sent his CFO to a dinner in his place and carried cartons of diapers down a narrow stairwell while Clara took notes about pharmacy hours that made no sense. He didn't speak much during the sessions. When he did, it was to ask a practical question, the kind that moved a conversation forward without stealing the focus. Mostly he watched Clara's posture as she listened, the way she slowed her pen so a teenager could finish a sentence, the moment her throat worked when a father said, "We're tired, but we don't quit." He had thought obsession would look like chasing. It turned out to look like presence. Kellen noticed that too. After one meeting at the clinic, he drew Clara aside, motion gentle. "You're extraordinary at this," he said. "Our program will live or die by whether we can bottle what you do in a room." "You can't bottle it," she said, smiling a fraction. "You can hire for empathy, train for follow-through, and create space for people to tell the truth." He nodded, practiced humility playing across his features. "You and I think alike. On outcomes, maybe," she allowed. "And on storytelling," he pressed. "If people see your face beside this work, they'll give. With your permission, I'd like to announce your advisory role next week." Before she could answer, Sebastian stepped in. Not abrupt, just there. "You'll announce the pilot," he said. "You'll list the services, the hotline, the staffing plan. If Clara's name appears at all, it will be in the acknowledgements, alongside the nurses and family reps who built it." Kellen's smile thinned at the edges. "I respect your position," he said, which meant he disliked it. "It isn't my position," Sebastian replied. "It's the right one." Clara touched Sebastian's wrist, a small reminder that victory wasn't the goal, integrity was. She turned back to Kellen. "Send me the draft. I'll mark it up." "Of course," Kellen said, acceptance smooth as glass. On the ride home, Sebastian stared out at the river, jaw set. Clara leaned her head against the window and let the city slip by. "You didn't have to come to all of them," she said, half teasing. "I did," he answered, plain. "When you're in rooms that matter, I want to be the person carrying water bottles and taking calls in the hall. So you don't have to." She laughed quietly. "You hate being in halls." "I don't mind when the room on the other side contains you." She turned her hand, palm up on the seat between them. He fit his into it. The contact calmed, something restless in him, the same way it had the first time she fell asleep on his shoulder in a car. He didn't name it. He simply kept holding on. Back at the penthouse, an envelope waited. No logo, thick paper, a single glossy photo inside, Clara and Sebastian on the courthouse steps weeks ago, rain in the air. His umbrella tipped over both their heads. A neat line, hand-written at the bottom. Public stories always start somewhere. Let's write the next chapter well. Care. Clara read it and felt her chest tighten. Not fear, not flattery. A warning wrapped in charm. She handed it to Sebastian. He took one look, then slid the photo back into the envelope and set it aside. "We'll keep the focus where it belongs," he said. "On the work, on the people, on us, on our terms." Clara reached for his hand again. "On our terms," she agreed. The next morning, he showed up to her earlier stop with coffee and a plain grey tee, no entourage, no tie. When the coordinator asked if he was there to observe, he shook his head and held up a roll of tape. "Point me to a box," he said. Clara watched him. This man, who once treated affection like a risk, now learning how to stand next to her without swallowing the space. He hadn't just refused the rival's framing, he had chosen a better one. Show up, carry, wait, let the work speak. She smiled and handed him a clipboard. "Welcome to the team," she said, and meant every word. Clara first noticed it at the clinic on Halstead. She'd slipped into the hallway after a listening circle to speak with a mother who couldn't stay because her parking meter was ticking. They were halfway through a plan for meal deliveries when a man in a dark jacket positioned himself between Clara and the exit. He was discreet, courteous, and very much there. Security, hired by Sebastian. New faces each day, same formation. At the next session, a driver waited at the curb, even though she'd said she'd walk. Later, she learned her calendar had been mirrored to his. Her afternoon coffee with Wren at the bookstore somehow became a chauffeured stop with a guard lingering by the display of cookbooks. None of it was loud. It was precise. "Is this really necessary?" she asked on the ride home. Voice even. Sebastian's gaze moved from her hands to the city outside. "Yesterday, a photographer tried to follow you into a clinic restroom," he said. "Today, a blogger called the hospital, pretending to be a relative to get Eli's chart. I won't give them an inch." She didn't argue the incidents. She pushed at the edges. "I can ask for help when I need it. I'm not waiting for you to be cornered," he said. "I'm making sure you aren't." At the penthouse, the mail tray held another envelope with clean handwriting, a clipped article about the pilot program, and a note, "Great work, deserves support. Let's talk scale." No signature. This time. She slid it under a stack of recipes and told herself it wasn't a message worth her pulse. The evening moved quietly. They ate simple pasta. He told a dry story about a supplier who tried to bill him for fog machines at a sober luncheon. She laughed. He lit up at the sound. Later, while she answered emails at the dining table, she saw, nearly hidden in a shared folder, a file labeled Field Movements, a grid of her upcoming stops with color-coded coverage. Heat rose under her skin. She closed the laptop. "Sebastian," she said. Steady. He looked up from his phone. "Yes, we need to talk." He heard the tone. He set the phone face down. "All right." She gestured toward the study, not wanting to stage the conversation where they ate. He followed, shoulders squared. The part of him that negotiated with governments snapping to attention. The door remained open, by her choice. She stood with her back to the window. The city was a cool sheet of light behind her. He stood in the lamplight, patient, waiting for terms. "Start," he said softly. She took a breath. "What you're doing might keep cameras away. It's also tightening a ring around my life." His eyes didn't flinch. "My job is to remove threats. You've made my work a threat to manage," she said. "That's the problem." Her fingers curled around the back of a chair. "You're not protecting me. You're caging me." The words landed between them with the clarity of glass on stone. He didn't rush to deny it. He lifted his chin a fraction, as if bracing for weather. One line changed everything. One call raised the stakes. Click. Part 2 now. And subscribe so you don't miss what unfolds next.